I'll share a little bit about the resources and historiography so you get a sense of like what I'm working with material wise and what I'm working with in the context of the other histories that, inspired me to do this work and with which I work. I'm going to restate um, the questions that I sent um, in terms of my questions that I'm still working through for this chapter. And then I will show a few pictures to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about and what we'll be talking about today. And I'll also kind of explain some of the differences between like the dissertation version of this chapter and the version that you guys read or are staring at now. So the whole project, I don't actually have, I'm not sure on the book title yet. I'm think I'm gonna call it Strong Enough to Remove Dirt and Skin, which comes from a quote from Procter and Gamble in 1931, where they say, "The process of making soap is a delicate one, of making a solution that's strong enough to remove dirt, but not strong enough to remove skin." And I argue that in many ways, if you look at it from production and agriculture up to the industrialization and production of soap, the making of soap isn't always held delicately, and it oftentimes does produce a solution and a process that's strong enough to remove dirt and skin. So I think that's where I'm going to go with the title, strong enough to remove dirt and skin. But I'm still TBA, but I'm working on it with Duke. I'm writing with Elizabeth Alt, who's incredible. Very excited about that. She's like Black Shoals with Tiffany King. I don't know if you're familiar with that and other works, but that's been a really good process so far. And you guys read the first chapter, which is following. I'm not sure how I'm going to handle the introduction because I kind of want a short, kind of accessible kind of invitation of a first chapter that doesn't really get too much into the weeds. So I think I'm gonna have like a I'm still kind of figuring that out. So this might end up being the second chapter because there'll be a more substantial first chapter to kind of follow the introduction. So I'm thinking about having a chapter basically on oilseed archives. So it just really just kind of takes a step and looks at the how we can use oilseeds as an archive of telling historical past climates. I oftentimes use the example of tree rings. Are you guys familiar with tree rings and telling like history of the climate? Right? Well, tree rings are super useful if you're in a temperate place, right? But if you're in a place in the tropics and you slice a tree in half, the tree rings don't show a demarcation of the winter. They might show sometimes a demarcation of precipitation, but they don't show the demarcation of wintering periods in a consistent way like one in the temperate north does, because a tree ring is the byproduct of the vascular cambium growth tissue stopping during the winter. So in most of the tropics, unless you're at a particular elevation where it gets cold enough to winter, we don't have trees to help us tell stories of past climates, right? And in many ways, a lot of people you tell this, they kind of like, oh, I just thought trees grew rings, right? And to some extent, that's kind of an example of how the study of climate and environment in temperate regions oftentimes can obscure and undermine our abilities to tell past, history. So the oil seed, I kind of deal in this chapter to kind of understand like why it's central in the dry tropical zones in dry tropical forests. And I think that's important because wet tropical forests were not the site of plantations mostly. Most plantations were in dry tropical forest regions, right, in the Americas. So I kind of isolate like how oilseeds had kind of a relationship with the environment and ecology in the space that kind of that is not necessarily rooted in colonialism, but was adapted by colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and anti-black racism. So like that. So I think oilseeds to me serves as an interesting archive, not necessarily because it's biology, in a way a paleobotanist might look at, bacterial lipids in a lake bed to show, change, but it showed the proximity of oilseeds to the Black experience throughout diaspora. And that's not just in the Mexican context, that's throughout the Americas, from cotton in the US South to cotton in Brazil to cacao in Brazil and in Mexico, to today we have, oil palm, plantations throughout, places of the Black diaspora in the Americas. So the first chapter kind of deals with that. You read the second chapter, which really kind of looks at the role of oilseeds in the late 19th century, early 20th century, in kind of shaping this kind of Pacific world kind of trade, but really kind of tied to the Pacific coast of the United States in a relationship with with the United States. The second chapter shifts into cotton, and I feel like as a historian of Mexico, in the 20th century, you always have to figure out what are you going to do with the revolution. You know, you always have to figure out what you're going to do with the revolution. The revolution from 1910 to 1920. You can't just skip over it, right? And it's always interesting to how environmental historians deal with that. The way I dealt with it is I looked at three different agrochemical revolutions, I call silent revolutions, that took place in the 1910s that would fundamentally change how agrarian reform and agricultural modernization would take place in Mexico. So I look at hydrogenization, which is the adding hydrogen to molecules to make fats into, or vegetable oils into fats and other processed materials. I also look at nitrogen fixation, which is basically the same thing, but fixing nitrogen to make a type of nitrogen that's bioavailable for plants, because the nitrogen that's in the air needs another nitrogen molecule to actually be bioavailable to plants through the soil. So I look at that kind of nitrogen fixation. And the last, I look at slow release arsenic, which was a way to mechanize arsenic to not be released on contact when it touches a plant, because that could hurt the plant tissue. But once it reaches the stomach of an insect that eats the plant, or eats the arsenic. So that slow release really fundamentally changed how we created insecticides and pesticides in the 20th century. And all three of these chemicals changed how agrarian reform would take place in Mexico. That's chapter 2. Chapter 3, I shift to labor. And I make the argument that even though there's empire here, even though the environment matters, even though technology matters, hands do the cleaning, right? So I really look at the chapter 3 is called Hands Do the Cleaning. I got goosebumps, like it's a decent title. But and so I look at basically the labor movements coming out of the Mexican Revolution that tried to reshape the political economy of soap production and oilseed production in the coast that you guys read about today. That's chapter 2, and it's probably my most dense kind of political chapter that kind of follows a few kind of political figures in the coast throughout the 1920s, 30s, and shows how oilseed-related agrarian reform and social movements informed the production of ejidos or collective land use patterns in the state of Guerrero in the 1930s. From that, and one of the arguments I try to make in that chapter is I try to really show that one of the major unions that mobilized a rebellion in the 1920s to wrest control of the soap production from the Spanish to peasant landowners was called the Union of Ambos Costas, or the Union of Both Coasts. And in many ways, the coast that I'm looking at has two coasts, Costa Grande and Costa Chica. And Costa Chica is the one that's more associated with Afro and Afro-Indigenous populations, but is oftentimes kept out of histories of the revolution, kept out of histories of social movements, kept out of histories of agrarian reform. We don't know too much about what happened in that region in these moments. So one of the main things I want to do in Hands Do the Cleaning is actually argue that the social movements that took place in the coast were actually a union of both coasts, right? So I look at the lineages and the people that are coming from both Costa Chica and Costa Grande in that movement. So in chapter 4, I look at agrarian reform, particularly in Costa Chica, and look at how the aftermath of that kind of take place in the coconut plantation, the sesame plantations that are really founded in the wake of, Black cotton-led plantations throughout the most of the colonial period in Costa Chica. Chapter 5 is processing revolutions, where I really kind of zoom back out to the whole Pacific coast, and I look at how oil seeds from Chiapas, Guerrero, Michoacan, all the way up are central to the Green Revolution. Most of the narratives around the Green Revolution, which starts in Mexico in 1943, is really centered on grains, looking at histories of wheat and histories of corn. But what I argue in that chapter is you can't talk about the Green Revolution and how it started, how it expanded, and how it still exists today in the form of biofuels without looking at the role of oilseeds in the Green Revolution in the 1940s. So I look at the whole coast of the Pacific in chapter 5. And then chapter 6, my last chapter, looks at that Green Revolution of oilseeds, particularly in Costa Chica. So it goes from Costa Chica in chapter 4 in the 1930s and 40s to the 1940s and 50s, and chapter 5 throughout the whole Pacific coast, zooming back into Costa Chica in 1950s and 60s. And that's kind of how I end it. And I think I'll title the conclusion. I think I'm going to title chapter 6 after the book. So I think the chapter 6 might hold that title, strong enough to burn, to remove skin and a dirt. So A little bit on sources. There because of so in 1829, when Vicente Guerrero, the president of Mexico, the first Afro-Indigenous president in the history of the Americas, and the namesake of the state that I look at, abolished slavery, they also abolished the demarcation of Afro-descendancy in Mexico. So there's no longer like an Afro-hyphen Mexican, right? Or, that no longer exists. So in terms of records, from 1829 to 2020, there are very few records that actually explicitly state that a person of African descent in Mexico is going through a particular thing. So I use the oilseeds to triangulate like who and how, maybe not always at the individual level, but at the community level. Because today, the communities that I look at they proclaim to be 60, 70, and sometimes 80% Afro-descendiente. So I look at these at the community level, how this kind of looks takes root. And I mostly use agrarian records. I use a lot of economic records from across Mexico City, and I can really get into that. But the bedrock of my research comes from the agrarian records from the ejido movements in Mexico. So there are 29,500 ejidos in Mexico collectively held land grants that cover about 43% of the entire country's arable land. So I use the records on that. So every ejido has probably about, like 20 or so boxes worth of materials. So I look through those for stories on oilseeds, which quickly gets into histories of violence, histories of race, and histories of marginalization. So that's kind of my kind of bread and butter archival matter. And I'll show you a few pictures that I found. And it's really interesting because there aren't that many photos in this archive. So when I find a photo, the archive stops. Like all the archivists put their things down. They're like, what did you find, right? Like, where was it, right? And it's like a huge party. It's like super cool. So I'll show you some of the things that I found in that archive that really kind of really sit with me. I made a mistake and I don't actually have a copy of my reader. Can I see that reader real quick? Yeah, thank you so much, because I have my questions that I wanted you guys to look at on here, and I don't have a copy of this up here with me, so I'm just going to read them. So this is really getting into the writing of the piece, some of the questions I kind of laid out in the beginning that I'm really thinking through. Some of these are on style, some of these are kind of general questions, but does the conversational tone in the chapter, does it work? Particularly in the earlier sections, I asked some questions. I use a couple we's, maybe an us, I don't know. So I was just asking about the tone. 2, does this section on archive, I think that's the second section on 19th century archive, does it feel well situated? I feel like that's one of the major things I changed in this chapter when I was revising it from the dissertation to now, was really adding that in there. 3, are the discussions on chemistry and biochemistry interesting or distracting or confusing? I would love to know if that is kind of helpful in illustrating and illuminating what I'm trying to say, or if it does the opposite. 4, is the chapter too long? Is the conclusion too short? And do any sections seem to drag or feel repetitive? And lastly, another general question, are any of the arguments unclear or unconvincing? So these are kind of general things I would love for you guys to consider as you kind of go through. And really quick, the last thing I want to say before I show you these photos, because I think I'm ready to show you the photos. Okay. Here, Paige, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay. Do I just click?
Yeah. Yeah, either way, I think it should.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is a picture of one of the Spanish-owned cotton mills that then became basically the peasant landless farmers who turned into ejidos took this over in the 1930s. So then becomes central to one of the most important ejidos that's churning out cotton, coconut, and sesame for the soap production in the coast. And this is called the El Progreso del Sur. And there's a super, super long, interesting history of this area that goes all the way up to the I don't know if you guys are familiar with the state of Guerrero, but it had the largest kind of guerrilla movement in Mexico in the 1970s, a movement called or led by a man named Lucio Cabañas. And he had a movement called the Partido de los Pobres and the Party of the Poor. And his family's is from right outside of El Piqui, and El Piqui becomes a center of agrarian struggle in the context of this it being the center of this tensions of oilseeds in the early 20th century. This is a picture of Afrodescendientes moving sesame to market. The long history of how they actually needed to use intermediaries, usually mestizo intermediaries, because they were not allowed to sell directly to indigenous communities or to mestizo communities. So they had to sell to mestizo intermediaries. This is a photo from the first scholar of Afro-Mexico, Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran, whose archives are at Northwestern, part of the reason why I went there. And I'm really building off of some of his work on, he analyzed some of the market relations, like I just stated, that the Afro-descendants weren't allowed to sell directly, but he did not spend real time looking at the history, just show the proximity of Black folks to sesame and coconut in the region. These are photos from the 1940s that kind of show on this side all the different products and sold in Mexico that are coming from the coconut palm. And then this is showing in the context of 1942 why there was a coconut boom and there was this need for coconuts in Mexico. And a lot of that goes in for a global history space, which this is. I think this is interesting. Is anybody familiar with Pearl Harbor? Okay, December 7th, 1941. Does anybody know what happened December 8th, 1941? What the Japanese bombed next? They bombed the Philippines. And they particularly bombed the coconut infrastructure of the Philippines because it was so central to the Allied war effort, right? It produced a saline solution, it helped produce bombs, it produced soap, processed foods for soldiers. I mean, they went directly at the largest coconut infrastructure in the world. Now for export, because India has a lot of coconuts too, but there was mostly for domestic consumption. So the largest exporting entity at the time was the Philippines. And I think something that's also interesting in the context of global history and histories of agrarian modernization and the role of Mexico and things like Green Revolution is that in the context of the United States occupying the Philippines since 1898, you actually have several companies in the Pacific coast of Mexico, like Acapulco and Mazatlán, that are importing coconuts from the Philippines to produce soap and in Mexico to sell in different large cities like Mexico City. And that narrative of a developing country importing a raw material in the 1910s to produce a finished good is oftentimes not central to how we talk about agricultural change in Latin America. So I think it's just a really interesting example that how this moment in the Philippines shaped the coconut boom in Mexico, but it also shaped how soap and coconuts had been produced in Mexico all the way back in the context of the U.S. empire in 1898. This is just two maps that kind of just show how the state of Guerrero is central to the production of, on this side, sesame, and in this side, coconut. So you can both see that the coast of Guerrero is like the major zone for production of both of these products. And also, historically, it was the major zone for cotton production before that and cacao production before that. These are just two advertisements that come out in the context of the Mexican miracle, this moment in the 1940s and 50s where, you know, agricultural modernization and industrialization leads to new access to public health and, you know, higher quality living, but mostly for people in urban settings. And Milagro, which was a vegetable shortening that came from the Anderson Clayton Company, based in Texas. I feel like it's a really good kind of illustration of how the kind of erasure of the place where these products are coming, the raw materials are coming from, where you actually they sell the Mexican miracle of Milagro through this mestiza woman in the context of Guadalajara, Mexico City, selling these kind of like local crops. And I don't know if this is the example. I looked for it this morning. I couldn't find it in my dissertation, but one of these advertisements actually literally talks about milagro as being like it being great because of its purity and its whiteness, and that kind of narrative goes back to the histories of oilseeds and soaps all over. This is one of the photos I found in the archive that stopped everything. This is a photo of an Afro-descendant family in the coast of Guerrero, actually in Costa Grande, not Costa Chica, which is something that I do in that dissertation, is really show through oilseeds. You actually have large pockets of Afro-descendants in Costa Grande as well as Costa Chica, and kind of disrupting that narrative. And this is a practice that you see all over the world where coconuts are grown, of drying the coconuts in the sun. This process, I think it illustrates kind of also how technology changes communities' access and autonomy around the production of their own materials. Because as competition kind of between different companies kind of mounts, there becomes more emphasis on at what temperature are we drying these coconuts, because if we dry them at a certain temperature, how much oil can we extract? And really looking at this as a kind of an inefficient practice that needs to be replaced by drying centers, right? That are controlled by people who, one, own property and can purchase the technology. So I think this kind of shows both the labor and the political economy of soap production, but it also shows kind of a practice that doesn't exist today and started to wane in the 1940s and 50s, particularly because of the global competition surrounding coconut production and that manufacture. And I think that is my last photo. So I will sit down and we can talk about the chapter.
Thank you so much, Jayson. So for the benefit of folks who didn't manage to read the chapter, Lacey and I are just going to start off with like a couple of comments, which hopefully might help situate stuff, and then we'll open up after that. If I take more than 3 minutes, please somebody just yell it. Okay, it's not going to be 3 minutes. This is a stunning chapter, Jayson. You are a beautiful writer, and the way in which you're able to marshal multiple archival sources in multiple languages and multiple histories across the Pacific Coast was really, I was just like, how do you do this? So it was incredibly just a pleasure to read, and I really enjoyed it. So you trace the racial politics of empire by telling the story of one undertold source of energy for the Second Industrial Revolution, plant fats and oils. But rather than telling the story of the Industrial Revolution through the energy sources that drove those revolutions, coal and petroleum, you tell a story of lubricants and greases that, what you say, kept the Industrial Revolution turning on the micro, gear, and axle rod level. And I just love that phrase. And also want you to say a little bit more about where oilseeds sit within it. So if it's not an energy source, what is it, right? Like how is it consequential to the Second Industrial Revolution? I think you suggested in many ways that I wanted to hear you foreground more and just say a little bit more of, because it shapes the politics of consumptive desire around soaps and cleanliness and hygiene and its racial politics. It also sort of like lubricates the literal explosion of certain kinds of consumer products like Crisco, but it also, I think, shapes the political economies of these different kinds of places. And so one of the things that I thought was really great about the chapter is that oilseeds reveal a kind of way in which there are actually intertwined histories between industrial and commercial capital in a moment when historians typically try to separate those two, right? That commercial capital, transport, shipping, et cetera, works in one sphere, agricultural sector works in another, and industrialism works in another. And in telling the story of oilseeds as a story that crosses all of those, one of the things that you do so beautifully is to think about how the actual material properties of the oilseed, right? The fact that it doesn't waste and rot in the same way, even as it is organic, the way it's sort of like, suited to a particular dry tropical coast climate, actually bridges a kind of Pacific coastal political economy that wouldn't sort of exist without the particular climactic factors and forms that that sort of brought that kind of transport and shipping into being. So I thought that way of telling the story was really wonderful. And so more generally, I thought the contribution of your work is that you really start to get us out of an object-oriented commodity history frame, which I think a lot of commodity histories kind of, and I think I'm curious about sort of why, because I'm not trained as a historian, right? But often it seems to me that often the most graspable way to tell histories of empire, is to tell them through sugarcane, etc. In part because archives are organized by companies that dealt with proprietary products, right? And so it's easy to identify which sugar company was working in a particular zone. And so the ways in which you exceed that by going to archives that are actually about like landed property in different ways, like it seems to me to be also a different method of archival knowledge that I wonder if you could say a little bit about. But I think the thing that I was most excited by, I mean, not most excited by, but one of the things that I thought was so deft in your paper chapter is that what you say is we can't get at the history of oilseeds or this undertold source of the second industrial revolution through singular commodities. First, because oilseeds were made fungible through chemical processes that rendered them indistinct. And second, that this fungibility doesn't just work at the concrete level of the manufacturing process, right? So the fact that a product can say this product contains multiple oils, it is about sort of the concrete level at which scientific and chemical processes worked. But second, you use fungibility as a sort of more theoretical abstract term to tell us about how the levels of abstraction at which capitalism work also reflect back onto the fungibility of oils. And so if capitalism abstracts the particular values and differences and racial politics of people, places, and plants and turns them into commodities, everything from enslaved labor to indigenous land to oleogenic plants, one of the ways that you are helping us to kind of retell that story is that, you know, in some ways, there's also a way in which the material properties of the plants speak back, right, to capitalism's attempts at fungibility. The ways in which indigenous knowledges shaped how Afro-Descendant populations were able to nurture particular forms of knowledge, the ways in which soap was shaped by Black labor. And so I was really interested in the way that that fungibility has this kind of flip side, which is, I think, in a kind of tradition of environmental and non-human histories, that you both kind of tell us the story about how capitalism abstracts, but then in some ways refuse that history by thinking about the forms of resistance that exist in these kinds of human-non-human interactions. So I think I'll just stop there and turn it over to Casey.
Wow, fantastic. I really enjoyed reading this. I moved quickly through it, so if I'm off base with comments, let me know. We can talk about that. I'll pick up with this idea of the commodity. As you know, well aware, and presented in the chapter, there's this long tradition of commodity studies. It really helps us get at certain things. It allows us to deal with scale, the local to the global. It allows us to see the flow of capital, of labor, all through these objects, all these people's daily lives and productive lives. I think what Charmaine was saying is absolutely true. There is this key in thinking through the commodity, which of course comes out of Marx and is sort of distilled by anthropologists such as Mintz and Wolf and Angel Palermo and other Mexican anthropologists might include in this. It allows us to sort of understand the exchangeability of people, their labor, the abstraction, these things, but also how capitalism is producing diversity and heterogeneity all the time. So that's an insight, I think, from anthropological commodity studies that Charmaine mentioned that you're working with, that you could sort of run with. So that's where I think something really interesting happens with this study, which is kind of a regional study in many ways. It's a study of a region that's sort of understood in Mexico as a Black region, and one that has been sort of understudied and unknown for a lot of sort of Mexican historiography. But now it's coming out. There's a lot of stuff coming out, and I think that's a really important intervention, sort of regional focus of this story. One thing I think that is interesting that you could build, I haven't seen everything, but moving forward, what might be interesting is to sort of connect back out to the global. For example, when does linseed first turn into an industrial process? It's probably earlier than cottonseed. When does cottonseed become a food?
Yeah.
These kinds of things, because as we go through the history of capital and state, which is sort of intervening through agrarian reform and building plants and sort of coming into this local space, these people who are doing this, they go to the Philadelphia Commercial Museum, they learn about it, and they say, I'm going there. So there's a sort of a global story here, which could be sort of referred to constantly, perhaps, as you move through this more local region. I think that's an interesting tack back between these. I was gonna say about about the region as well. I think there's a really important discussion, and maybe I didn't read enough through the lines or see it come out to me in this chapter at least, but I'm really curious about the Afro-descendant agroecology. I feel like that's sort of the basis of what this regional identity, this region's sort of land tenure, what the state and capital is trying to deal with, harness, expropriate, take over. And I think that's sort of really interesting to sort of see that as a much more robust, like, this is a thing that existed before anyone else got there. And then come out, sort of present that forward, and then see like, okay, what are all these interventions trying to sort of once again sort of expropriate, articulate with, and sort of suck value out of this region. So there's a lot about sort of so that agroecology would be really interesting, and the place of oilseeds in it, or oils, plant oils, because as you make a really good argument, these are sort of long traditions of growing in certain latitudes in certain places in the world. Sesame, I think your argument was that is an African crop, and it's coming in the New World. Cotton is, of course, as well. So like a lot of those longer traditions of Black agroecology would be really interesting to see straight up in the front. I liked the biology discussions. I think those are really good ones. Once again, rooting us into sort of the materiality of the space and the region and people. I thought that was great. There's lots more to say, but I think everyone else has something to say too. So I'm really excited about this. I can't wait to talk more.
Hey, do you want to open straight up, or do you want to take your own questions?
We can open straight up. Did you have a suggestion?
No, I was gonna suggest that you could field your questions and,
Okay.
yeah, just reiterating that whatever amount that you've been able to digest the work is great. If you have any questions, I think also about methods in writing, Jayson willing to talk about that as well.
And also, I can also respond to some of the questions that were just raised in the comments too. Even though I really need to write some of the ones that you said down for me, because I didn't get them fully because they were just too good.
I'll send this to you.
I appreciate it. On the Black agroecology, I think that's a really important point. And in the oilseed archives chapter, I definitely do try to look to some extent like how Black and Indigenous communities, use different oilseeds in the region historically. Unfortunately, I just don't see the archives there, and I'm not an anthropologist, and as a Black person, I feel like I'm oftentimes, in Mexico, I can sometimes be very pigeonholed into like, oh, you study Black folks here. And I get a lot of pushback from that. So I try to create a narrative that actually speaks to like oilseeds that are produced, not through all the Guerrero. So like this is really tied to like the regions of Tierra Caliente, Sinaloa, I feel like this resonates with a lot of, so I have to follow a close line there, which is something I don't think a lot of my colleagues that study Afro-Mexico have to deal with. And then just too, like I don't really want, I think a lot of doing that work well would take, anthropological field work with community now. And I'm just not the best person to do it. And I think that's really exciting because like just since I've been studying the state of Guerrero in the last 10 years, like I ran into like students from Guerrero who are now working on PhDs on the state, right? And like I just, there's, I think part of being a historian is just kind of like, learning what to do with the limits you have. And I think there are ways I think I can foreground that more and I can do better at that. I definitely, it's a tough thing I deal with. And as someone who just writes, and we can talk about this a little bit more with writing in general. I personally have a long history with like Black environmental politics in this country. My family were some of the first landowners in the state of Maryland, Black landowners. And I do love to write Black environmental history. But I feel like oftentimes when I'm in the context of Mexico as a Black person, I'm asked to like validate Blackness and stuff for community. And that's not my job as a Black person, as an academic, as a writer, so that's a hard thing I have to navigate, but I really, really appreciate you raising that because like it's something I'm always thinking, and I feel like I have other outlets to kind of do that history and do those things. So I just feel like I I might downplay that more than a scholar who considers himself an Afro-Mexican scholar. I do not consider myself a scholar of Afro-Mexico. I study a region that has Black folks, and as a Black person, I have a Black perspective that informs my work. But like, that's something it's a difficult thing, it's a difficult thing. Oh, I think the last thing I'd say too is like, I think what I'm doing is different than like, I work closely with Case Watkins on palm oil diaspora. I love how people can study the Afro-descendant population through like the gaze of people looking Black today. And one of the things that I'm doing is not necessarily saying that Black and Indigenous people, do this today or something. I'm saying they shape the landscape. Like the landscape is and similarly how Case said, like the landscape is an archive of Black and Indigenous stewardship, right? Like in a way, like it's it's here. But I also personally think, and this goes back to my own personal roots in the part of Maryland where Harriet Tubman started the Underground Railroad. The only reason why I exist today is because some of those processes were illegible. And I just have to reckon with the fact that I can't tell all those stories because they were illegible then, and people exist today because they weren't understood, right? And that's part of studying Guerrero, right? But I'll end it there. But I just really appreciate that question because it really gets into the richness of doing Black history, like doing, being a Black scholar,
Especially particularly in Mexico.
And yeah, it's tough. It's tough,
Different.
It's tough because people will straight up say like that's not relevant to most of Mexico. That's not relevant, I'm like, actually look at this, like how much sesame is in your food? A lot. Okay, let's go, so
Thanks.
thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll just open up to whoever, and Jason, if you just
I'll
want to
field.
field your own.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just not the biggest person, so I have to like, but yes, I'm ready. Yes.
Okay. So what you're doing,
Kasha, if you would introduce yourself to them.
hello, everyone. Hi, my name is Keisha Arnold. I am the Assistant Director at the Blum Center for Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy here at UC Santa Barbara. And when I was a grad student here, I fell in love with the Global Studies Department, and I think this is a wonderful, it's wonderful to come back and be here this afternoon. A lot of my research looks at global commodities in the Pacific, and fats and oils are big. They loom large in my world. So I was very excited to have Jayson here, and then to go back to what you've asked us to sit with. So this morning there was an article in the New York Times that caught my eye. It was saying that Mexico has now replaced China as the largest exporter to the United States, and since this is a big development. And I think going back to what your work shows us is like the establishment and development of these networks, that have these global ties that are attached to older legacies of imperialism. And this also, just to add in, this makes me think of, there's this important book called Trade Wars or Class Wars by Pettis and Klein. And they're looking at how there's this, and I'm talking about China in this context. They're looking at how there's these issues between US and China trade because US producers are losing out to elites. At the same time, Chinese producers are losing out to Chinese elites. And then they're really critical of the lack of Chinese consumption in the 21st century. But if you look, and this makes me think of Mexico and what you're talking about here, China wasn't always this large, scary economy to the US. It started out as a developing economy, and it was tied to the global economy. It had all these exports because the people felt like in order to, get by from day to day, that's what they had to do. When we shift and look at your world, when we look at what's happening in Mexico with the production of these fats, and how I'm curious if you can explain to, like, when we look at the difference between production and consumption. Production, is this going for export versus production going for consumption? How is consumption factoring in for these producers? Are these fats or like cottonseed oil, copra, I'm drawing a blank. It starts with the P. The fat with the P. Anyways, we look at the production of these fats and oils. are they being tailored in any ways for the consumption of these populations? Meaning, is this something that's saying like they're being prioritized, their inputs, their tastes, their preferences, or is this something that's being looked through the Western gaze as we need to be really more influenced by what's happening within the United States and how they're looking at chemistry and advertising and the whiteness of it all? And I think that this is really important because this is also about development and how, how is this region being attached to the global economy? Who is it for? How are the people producing it able to make a place of their own or not? And if you could speak to that within this work.
Yeah. That's a great question. I do think in terms of who's consuming most of the soaps and the fat oils from the jump, it's mostly not for export to Germany or the United States. Like it's sent to Mexico City and Guadalajara.
Okay.
So we're talking about this is also connected to some of the first big kind of sanitary campaigns in the Porfiriato in the 1880s to the 1910s. So this is all time, thinking about how these new urban spaces in Mexico and are still thinking through like global conversations of sanitation, trying to imitate what they see in other countries, there's still the major soap company I look at is called Snowball. Like it has this image of pure whiteness still, right?
Yeah.
Like so I definitely do think there's still this global conversation sanitation that's happening there. One thing I think is interesting just in terms of thinking about how detergents eventually really undermine prices for raw material producers, because the difference between soap and detergents is one comes from raw materials and the other ones come from synthetics, is actually the soaps that they're producing. If we're now we're talking about the coast, they don't work as well in hard water.
No, yeah.
Right. So like that's something really interesting. Like a lot of these early toilet soaps are being produced for places that have more potable water. So like that off top. Like so, but the detergents in the 1950s actually are more useful in some of these rural settings.
Okay.
Right, where water is harder. So I do think that's an interesting kind of dynamic and on the soap level. But what I see generally from the 1880s to the 1920s is kind of, for lack of better terms, the biodiversity of oil seeds kind of waning. They're, if you looked at some of the the botanists that are going into this region, in the early 20th century, they're seeing a couple dozen different oil seeds that are being used by local producers, right? But by the 1920s, a lot of the forests are being replaced by, first coconut orchards and groves, but then are expanded into plantations. So it's interesting when you look at some of these areas, a forest with 15 different types of palms might not look that much different than a plantation, but in terms of a place with products that are accessible community, it's infinitely different, especially when you're talking about in 1926, you have new laws about who can go into the forest to actually, get their own forest products. That changes in this context with the plantation zones being reestablished, right? So there's definitely, I think the naturally occurring oil seeds are being replaced by, imported oil seeds, like the coconuts that are coming from the Philippines, right? Like it's not a type of palm that's from the coast, right? The sesame that becomes, plantation to the coast is not from the coast. So you see a replacement of the cayuco or, other different oil seed crops that are, that were being foraged historically.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you. And then just on the note too, I really like how you talk about cleanliness and the soap, the phrase strong enough to remove dirt and skin. And there's this, I would come across this phraseology in similar discussions about soap production, but also that soap consumption, that signals when a country is developed, or that's how you can tell when this is a civilized place. And so I was just wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to that in terms of, is that really when we're looking at how this is being produced and grown, is it really for those actual purposes? How are they internalizing these narratives? I'm trying to figure out, when does this come out? And soap's so big in the 20s, it's associated with whiteness and cleanliness and purity. But within Mexico, I'm just so fascinated, how are they absorbing this message? And like, is it experts? Is it advertisers? Is it government, like officials? Where is this idea coming in that, okay, now in order for us to prove that we are modernizing, we have to have soap? I'm just curious if you could speak to that a little more.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I honestly didn't. I feel like to answer that question, I'd be drawing mostly on secondary sources,
Okay.
because that's not like
Okay.
I didn't do most of that looking into the advertisements in the early, in like the Propiato, like most of the newspaper, they're, and it's interesting because when you look at, if you look at soap companies coming from Argentina in, you know, the 1880s to like 1906, or the United States, Pears, for instance, you have a lot of really vivid illustrations, right? Of like a white lady with a particular type of complexion saying, you can be this beautiful, or you be this pure with this type of soap, or something like that. You have the Pears, you know, the famous Pears soap where it's like a black baby is dipped into a bath and they come out white, you know, like, so you do see a lot of illustrations. Most of the soap advertisements that I've seen in Mexico don't have that many illustrations, and they might reference purity. I haven't seen that many references to like blancura or like whiteness or something like that, like until a little bit later. But I'd use a lot of sugar. I literally was just in a workshop with this person. I cite them in text, but they wrote on kind of monuments of progress during the Properiato.
Estonia. Yeah.
Claudia, duh. Sorry, Claudia. Sorry. We're literally working on a book. That's crazy. That's embarrassing. Sorry, Claudia, that's terrible. But she looked a lot at like the role of soap in these sanitation community, projects. But she's looking mostly in the context of Mexico City. So not really. I don't see too many rural sanitation campaigns yet.
Okay.
Right. I think those really come with, in the 1930s. You have yellow fever, and you see the start of malaria kind of intake, where people come and they're like, oh, cover that water, oh, take that away, or like that. You start to see, especially in the context of like Acapulco starting to become a bigger port city, early tourism type stuff. You start to see sanitation around kind of mosquitoes, right? You start to see sanitation around several different diseases that are common in the region, but I don't see too much of that tied to like actually the Mexican government or the military actually like handing out soap for the sanitation of like rural peasant farmers and stuff like that. I just don't see that much. But 100%, if you look at like the Ejido records, there's always a price for soap, right? In the Ejido. So like ejidatarios in the 1930s are using soap. It's there. It's not. I don't think it's something that's being forced on them necessarily. But I haven't seen too many government programs yet. But it's there. Like people are using soap, right? And they're buying soap, which is even more important, right? And then I will say this, like, and I talk a little bit about this. There definitely are like small soap manufacturers. Like soap manufacturing is something as petty as it gets, right? Like in terms of thinking like petty industries, like that, you see that everywhere, right? So you definitely have people making soaps, at the local level and selling them. But I just haven't found too much of that record, other than you'll see, I don't reference it this much in this chapter, but you'll see like, oh, soap from said naturally occurring oil seed is not as common because of cobra, So there is definitely a local soap production system or political economy that is kind of pushed out by the monoculture around these three
Thank you.
Yes.
Anyone else? I have a question. But this is really fantastic work. I wish I had more time to read it before today. But I wanted to key in on a point that Charmaine and I had discussed briefly before you began, which was about the fungibility point, which I think for me, it kind of popped out as being a really key moment in the first few pages of this chapter that highlight, on the one hand, why oil seeds matter in a kind of material, culture, and political economy of modernization in the 20th century that you tell like some really compelling stories about. But at the same time, like as Charmaine was saying, it's like the way that you put it forward, it really frames some important kind of ways. It gives us a way to think about the production of capitalism itself, right? And what I'm wondering here is if there's, in this chapter, in the first moves here, I felt like there was a tension between those things, like a set, like a framing of the fungibility of the sort of how do oil seeds become important, but then a focus on the oil seeds per se, right, as the object that we use to follow these histories. And so I was wondering, I don't know if you feel like that's off base or whatever, but like to me that just kind of emerged as a fascinating kind of tension in the chapter, and I wonder how it plays out in the rest of the book. And so I was wondering if I could burden you with just like giving us, you gestured at these things, but I was wondering if you could tell us about the role of oil seeds in the different chapters. So like one of the things, like it's really clear even in this chapter how oil seeds via industry and plantation economy shape fincas, right? But then I'm like, how do they shape ejidos? And you just gestured a little bit at that, but I'd love to hear more about how it actually shapes land reform as you make that argument. And then what are the other ones? It's of the silent revolution. So I was like, those also sound like they might thread across these other chapters too, the silent revolution and certainly nitrogen fixation. I guess like I don't know, is it like the hover process starts to become domestic too and shape landscapes, and then I would imagine that feeds into the Green Revolution chapter. So I'm thinking about this kind of hierarchy of like, if we were being really crudely social scientific, like the independent variable, right? Like the thing that's like causing stuff, rather than which I know you're not doing, but there's a certain kind of prioritizing of the oil seeds, at least in just the way that you put the story together, that makes us feel like this thing, like the non-human agential thing that we can follow and see how it shapes these other processes in ways that we just don't see because we're looking at human agency and like economies and market forces and these like ways that we interpret what we do. And so that's kind of, I was wondering if you could help to illuminate that tension, or to even make it look to give us that tension in a more fully productive way. Or if you can just show me how like I'm misunderstanding.
No.
The
I think
process.
that tension's interesting because I think at this moment, and I think in this moment there's a lot of uncertainty around these oil seeds, and I think part of the their interchangeability is because of this kind of scramble. I think I said something like, the search for like waxy, slippery and rubbery things. And so there is that moment of like economic botany in the late 19th and 20th century, also in the moment of like grand adulteration of things, right? Like, and like, so I think there is a tension there of both, like, I'm trying to like narrate how in the search for things, they were also putting down concrete, they were like, okay, so this company from Cleveland brings this expeller and develops this, soap factory in Acapulco in 1896 because it knows there's enough cottonseed for sure, and there's sesame is coming up, but they're also open to getting some of the other oil seeds that are just naturally occurring. So they have the cayuco, for instance, right? So there's and I think that's happening all over, right?
So the expeller press is producing the fungibility, right? So like that was one of the things I was thinking about, is that like, I mean, that when you highlight that they're shipping, literal liquid oil, and then it arrives in the north as solid fat, it's just like that is it's fascinating, and it's just kind of like mind-boggling. Like, why would you do that versus like produce in take the raw material and then refine in the north and not have to deal with that problem, or like what is the political economy of that? That I think about when I was reading this, I was thinking about Hannah Appel's work. She's an anthropologist, and she writes this book that's called The Illicit Life of Capitalism, and she is using offshore oil production, not because she's studying offshore oil production, but looking at the way that like discourses and business practices about how global capitalism is formed as like something that's, offshore and can be frictionless and so on, that there's a real parallel here, that the fungibility is having to be produced through so many different kinds of processes in particular places and shaping these landscapes and engaging, like all these longer histories of, what people might call ethnobotany in its moment of then capture and transformation by economic botany, right? And so like I'm wondering, yeah, that's like I feel like some of the tension around thinking about oil seeds versus this foregrounding the processes of fungibility are at those kinds of moments where there's, yeah, like the decision to import the oil expeller there and the decision to ship liquid oil and take on like solidified liquid oil in the transportation, that yeah, I'm just wondering about those histories and the decisions there that kind of make this bigger process of fungibility, not just around these materials, but really like are shaping 20th century capitalism, right? Like
Can I ask?
through those particular commodities and materials, but also beyond the way that we think about what capitalism does.
I guess I don't know if this is the question you're asking, but I also just want to remind folks to maybe turn towards like the feedback stuff that you were asking about so that we can
Sure.
make sure this is productive for you too. But
I mean, it'll be productive. I just threw those out because those are
Yeah.
questions I had,
Yeah.
but if you guys raise
Thoughts
your
on
own
those
questions,
things,
that's totally fine.
Okay,
But I
cool.
do appreciate that.
But I guess like maybe to tack on to Jiaqing's question, that was what I was wondering, is fungibility okay, because as a social scientist I look for the master concept that explains everything in the chapter, and as a historian that's probably not what you do. And so I'm also kind of curious, like Jiaqing, whether fungibility is like a useful explanation for the multiple things that oilseeds are, right? What there's a core part of the oilseed which is about the kind of indistinction of the expeller process and the way that it sort of plays a role in the creation of these commodities. But do you see fungibility as something that traces through the book, and is it something you want to trace through the book? Because I think like Jiaqing started to lose a sense of how the later part of the chapter helped me think about fungibility the same way that the first half did.
Yeah. No, I mean, I definitely carry it through, but mostly thinking about how different communities of oil producers start to protest the importation of oil seeds, but then also how Mexico starts to just invest in oil seeds writ large. So soy, well, not necessarily soy, mostly safflower and cottonseed in the north, in ways that I think just there's just I build off of an argument of a scholar, I think it's Steve Sanderson. He talks about how agriculture in Mexico is oftentimes an adjunct to industry, and that oftentimes like industry agriculture is oftentimes sacrificed for industry. So for instance, you oftentimes will have in the 1930s and 40s, and interestingly enough, one of the people on my dissertation committee grew up in Mexico City, and he remembered a lot of these protests outside of soap factories. So soap factory workers in Mexico City and Guadalajara would oftentimes ask the government, and they would ask the manufacturers to import more oil seeds, particularly coconut from the Philippines, so their factories didn't have to shut down for 3 months every year. But you also had raw material producers in the coast building unions asking to stop importing oil seeds. And you actually had, and so I go a little bit in chapter 4 and 5 about how you have the industries actually suggesting to the government that these raw material producers, while they're useful and it's good cheap labor and they can do it, they're not that efficient. We can't really trust them to do all this. So there's this constant, the Mexican government's constantly thinking, okay, we just need to produce more and more different types of oil seeds to make sure that the industry is and a lot of times, and this goes back to just the Green Revolution, the Mexican Miracle. Mexico is always thinking about how can we produce the most corn in Nayarit so it can get cheap to Guadalajara, so we don't have to worry about labor unrest there. right? They weren't as worried about labor unrest and, in the countryside nearly as much. They were worried about siphoning, and channeling. So a lot of the industrialization of agriculture was to feed cities, right? Like, and I think like that constantly you see the government and industry working together to produce oil seeds at the expense of oilseed producers, because they're like, we can just put more safflower there, more sesame there, more cottonseed there, and not necessarily thinking about the economic bottom line of the producers themselves who are arguing for consistent prices, right? So the government and industry is always shifting on that. And one tension I don't really carry through as much in the dissertation, and I don't know how much I'm going to be able to carry through in the book, is this tension between urban workers and rural farmers, right? Because they're asking for very different things and completely oppositional things, right? So that's kind of how I carry this kind of economic fungibility kind of going forward, where you see like later in the 1950s, communities are arguing against derivatives, right? They're like, we don't like fewer synthetics, like these things are undermining us, right?
Does that come into the book?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And one thing I want to think about a little bit more is kind of thinking, and this isn't necessarily as much on fungibility, but just thinking about how, just monoculture attracts these gigantic like pest epidemics. And how, and like one thing, like how monoculture, the interchangeable, how the commodification of a plant into just, that's, 1,500 banana boxes, right, kind of thing, like actually leaves a space more vulnerable. And then also in the context of the 1940s, you have different, agrochemical solution. They're just trying to figure out, okay, let's put this on this, we'll put this on this. And so there's an interchangeability of agrochemicals too, right? So I think, so that's, it definitely, I think it has, I think I could be wise to maybe lay out maybe a typology of fungibility. Like I'm talking about fungibility in a couple different ways here. Like, I think something like that could be really useful in the beginning. Like this is how we usually see it. This is how they're doing in Black studies. This is how they're doing in commodity studies. And I'm using it this way and this way, and kind of thing. Like I think something like that could be super useful.
It's really powerful.
And it maps onto the Mexican state's logic of commensurability. I mean, it's Porfiriato when they first start creating statistics, which you mentioned, cite, right? And then that gets stronger and stronger as you move to the 20th century. So they're sort of able to intervene populations, production in a way, but do that kind of a knowledge. It's like a state knowledge, right? So, and that's commensurate. That's sort of that's another aspect of commensurability.
Is there a cartographic level to all of this? I'm thinking state maps, the legibility of these different landscapes, through the eyes of the state, and you mentioned something. Oh, we'll put more sesame here, like we'll do this, whatever, cotton. It's like, how are these landscapes being like interchangeable? For state planners, for technocrats, for industry. And is there pushback? Is there a counter mapping happening?
I think a lot of that has to do with, so I kind of build off of Nicole Motier's work on Anderson Clayton in the 1930s in La Laguna, and kind of looking at how Anderson Clayton, as this kind of big Texas cotton firm, like actually comes into agreements to basically create like what was the term? For lack of better words, maybe like ejidos that had a particular relationship with a large industry, right? So so basically those you had about like 30,000 acres of land that were repatriated to ejidos, but they still produced cotton for Anderson Clayton. Like there wasn't like, it was like, this is going to be our land, but Anderson Clayton's going to give us all the arsenic. They're going to give us the technology and then get all the cotton. And basically Anderson Clayton kind of was like, okay, we don't have to own the land if we get the product, right? And I think that's really interesting now because you see how technology packages are more important than land, right? Like you see like how like, these big like Cargill, like these big, firms doing oilseeds, they'll basically send a technology package, and take over 1,500 hectares of land. They don't need to own it. They don't even need the labor. right? So one of the ways I see like this happening cartographically is in the coast is like how a very similar process happens through kind of collectivized ejidos around the production of particular commodity like coconuts or sesame, right? So it's yes, you own this land collectively, but you're still going to have a relationship with this industry, right? And that is kind of how, and it's really interesting to see like how, what is the enclavada? Like that's how they oftentimes talk about these nestled ejidos together, right? And then there's definitely conversation about where sesame grow near certain rivers or near certain lagoons, and certain land, agostadero or kind of dry pasture land becomes cattle farms. So there's a lot of tension there. So that's kind of the way that I see it a lot. Is actually in the formation of ejidos. And like who gets to who in regards to their proximity or relationship with an industry and a commodity gets to actually continue to produce that land on land that's ostensibly theirs, right? So like that's a big thing. And I can't remember who asked this question earlier, but just kind of how the oil seeds kind of carry forward. One of the things I think is interesting about the work is building off of the late Javier Valdez's work in Sinaloa. He was a reporter and a historian of cartels and organized crime in Sinaloa. And he wrote this beautiful book called Taken, before he was in fact taken and disappeared. One of the arguments that he made in Sinaloa, and I look at this pretty closely, is that he said the first organized crime in Sinaloa was around controlling agricultural labor. And if you look at the history of people fighting for so that's one of the cool things looking at this is I get to see like how like ejidatarios actually are like, we want those 500, like we want that land because it has 500 coconut palms that like we helped work on for years, or like we can monitor that and take care of that, right? But the people who are losing that are like, we're going to develop guardias blancas or armed forces, armed guards, and we're going to get that land back. So you see a huge creation. And again, like this is something that anyone in Mexico would resonate with, because guardias blancas were everywhere, right? But they were particularly strong around these kind of collectivized commodities that went to particular industries where, landowners historically had those relations, right? So you have these large guardias blancas or armed guards that literally terrorize communities, kill hundreds of people. There's one stat, I think that in 1942, 800 peasants were killed by like guardias blancas in like 3 municipalities, right? Like so you have the first organized crime, and I consider that organized crime is around the response to try to get that control of those oil seeds and those soap factories back, right? Because by 1932, that factory, the soap industry, they're all controlled by labor, right? But by 1950, they're not controlled by labor, right? They're controlled by basically ejidatarios that are essentially landholders. You have the rise of like the false ejidatario, right? That like claims to have some relationship with something, but they really have a relationship with owning land, right? And like that's something. So looking at that formation of like armed organized crime against labor to control labor is something I think is one of the ways that like really kind of shows, and what's really interesting. So the reason why sesame was grown in Sinaloa was basically because the president Lázaro Cárdenas, conducted a huge study on how to transport the sesame infrastructure from Tierra Caliente to southern Sinaloa. And it was in southern Sinaloa that the first armed guards around terrorizing sesame producers actually got paid by opium farmers. So there's a direct connection between the armed forces in Sinaloa, and lesser extent in Guerrero, but definitely on some level, where just large landholding families that put together, that get control of this land, they end up also selling some of their pistoleros to people who are growing drugs, or they start growing drugs themselves. So there's a direct connection there between the control of illicit oil seeds and then the control of illicit oil seeds. So that's kind of one of the big reasons why I kind of took on the illicit oil seed study, was to kind of tell stories of violence, right? And say that they're actually rooted in illicit oil seeds and government, activity and racism against Afro and indigenous farmers, as opposed to this thing that started, in the 1970s and 80s through cartels, right? So like that's something that really carries through too.
Just want to make sure that the two remaining grad students in the room have a chance to ask questions.
Hello, my name's Anam. Thank you so much for being here and for this chapter. It's really fun to read. I think that's like I have a couple of small questions. I think the first one is to respond to your question about the conversational telling. I really liked it. I think it also works super well with the more biology and science stuff. I was curious if you had thought about like playing around with the visual typology of the chapter and like boxes that have different tones or like sections within that are kind of more explicitly different from the others. And I think I was also curious as to like if a map would be useful and if that is it moves around a lot including Guerrero also. And I was curious like where
Was there a map in this chapter?
I think so.
I think so.
Oh, for real? I literally had a map made for this chapter and I didn't put it in the slides because I thought it was in the chapter. I'm so sorry. But I have this really, really cool, I'll pull it up because I work with a landscape architect who is an amazing illustrator and she helped me create this beautiful map. I'm so sorry. Yeah, no, I'll look it up. Continue, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. And then I need to go back to the questions around textology and where that ends up also. Like I feel like you're doing so much in terms of commodity history, cultural history, labor history, imperial history, racial history, and I was really curious as to who is like who you're speaking to or who you think you're going to speak to.
Yeah.
Where you kind of situate yourself within these discourses, and I like what you said around how you're doing something actually so different from and engaging in all of it, and that being something really expensive.
Yeah.
And so I think that was my second question. Third question was. I guess that's it. I loved it.
Thank you. I look forward to that. I feel like my audience right now, to me, I don't know, this is gonna be very transparent and maybe to me we write books to get jobs. Like and get tenure and stuff. And and for me, I'm writing this book so it can be translated into Spanish. Like, and I think like I read a lot of text, most of my historiography is in Spanish, and I think there is always this kind of combination of like how does it impact the indigenous folks? Like how is this political? How is this economic? How is this social? Like there's just like a lot going on in lots of different sections, tons of chapters. And I think one of the things I'm in my head, I'm thinking like this is a book that I want in Spanish, that I want this book because there aren't that many monographs on the history of Guerrero. Like there just aren't, especially that don't focus on like cartels. I mean, there just aren't. And so to me, that is the goal of this. That's my audience. Is Guerrerenses, 100%. Yeah, that's honestly an easy one. Because I just really want this book in Spanish. And if that wasn't my goal, I think I could produce enough articles and stuff to not make this into a book. But I'm grateful. I'm excited that Duke wants it, and I think it's in conversation with a lot of work in Duke Press. So I think there's a little dialogue I love there with a lot of work that's come out in political ecology and environmental history and kind of Black environmental scholarship through Duke. So I just think that like I want to be connected to those folks, but I really want to see this book in Spanish, which is kind of my big kind of goal.
My third question. Thank you. I think if when you said that there are thousands of ideas and that each one has a massive archive of folded, I was curious just like what your experience in the archive was and how you choose.
Yeah. Well, one, let me say to start, the Agrarian Archive is violent. It's a violent place, and it's honestly I'm sometimes ashamed to work in it. It's so violent. So when you go to the Agrarian, have you ever been there, Casey?
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm about to say.
Secretaría de Reforma Agraria.
Yeah. So there are two salons. There are two places to do research. There's the place where people with kind of PhDs doing archival projects can go upstairs, separate of their own, take as many pictures as they want, do whatever they want. And then there's a big salon for literal farmers who travel thousands of miles to come to this archive because they're trying to get papers and make a lawsuit or fight some like local agrarian issue, maybe a neighbor, maybe a landowner. They're literally, they drop everything, travel hundreds of miles to go there. They can't use pens, they can't take pictures, they have to pay 500 pesos for a copy. Like the agrarian archive, it actively sustains land injustice.
Super exclusive.
It is
exclusive, but it's like a filter. Yeah.
So first and foremost, I cannot talk about that archive without stating that. Like, it is embarrassing to walk up those stairs to that separate private room. And I'm constantly asking folks, hey, you know, like I have friends in Montalto or like friends in Copala, like, do you need files? Like, I will just take extra pictures. Like, do you need anything? But I wish I could go in that room and just be like, hey, oops, like, what you looking at today? And like, I'll just add it into my queue, you know? It is a violent place. It's probably one of the most violent archives in the whole country.
Plus the contents.
I mean, the contents are as political as it gets.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I don't think there's an archive. And I used to work in military archives and had to get like military escorts if I needed to get chapstick out my backpack, right? And I still don't think those are nearly as violent as the agrarian archive. Nearly, you know? So, and my selection is oilseeds. Like, there's thousands and thousands of things you can, and I look for sesame, I look for coconut. And it's interesting, when I find the coconut, I see someone saying like, this person killed my neighbor because we got the coconut tree, or like, you know, because we got this coconut grove, or, you know, we want, you know, so it ends up there's political narratives and relationships and histories that are connected to those. So that's been, and also following oilseeds has oftentimes led me to, you know, los negros afuera de este, you know, ejido, right? You know, and like talking about like the black people on the outside of it, you know, so like there's this weird, sometimes like once in a 500,000 sheets, I might see like a small reference to like something that might be like a person of African descent, right? Like, you know, like, and that's why people just drop everything when like, you know, I have the only copy of the Phototeca of the Agrarian Archive because I could add to it because like no one finds photos, you know. But so that's usually because you could look through, and one thing I did not do and I need to do better is I should have followed patriarchy more. I think anybody who studies Ejido should follow patriarchy more. I mean, just in terms of just thinking about like, where does the land get passed down to? Like, you know, like patriarchy is fundamental in terms of like what like undermines the Ejido system. Like, and I think that's one thing, if I had to start over, I would have done that more consistently through. 100%. That was one thing I should have been Palms and Patriarchy. It should have been the project. But that was, and I just don't know how I could just tag that on now.
Next book.
Yeah, but that's just something. There needs to be a book on just kind of like how land reform is completely undermined by patriarchy. Just like fundamentally, you know. But yeah.
Well, with that, anybody has dying wish to say last words? Not literally dying. Is anyone dying to say last words?
Thank you for sharing your
Yeah.
We can answer.
No, I